At 9:30 in the morning on May 1, 1942, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki stood inside the converted mess hall of the battleship Yamato, watching junior officers slide wooden blocks across a massive table designed to represent the entire Pacific Ocean. Around him, 20 senior admirals, stiff in their dress uniforms, filed into the room, each followed by aides carrying folders of operational plans, maps, and coded dispatches. They had gathered to conduct the most important war game Japan had ever attempted, the rehearsal of the operation that, in their minds, would win the Pacific War. Their target was Midway Island, a lonely atoll 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan was the brainchild of Admiral Yamamoto, a masterpiece of deception designed to lure the American carriers into a trap, annihilate them in a single decisive battle, and force the United States to negotiate peace. It was brilliant, complex, and required the coordination of hundreds of ships spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The war game was meant to expose flaws before the first shot was fired, but it never had a chance to do that, not with Ugaki serving as chief umpire. He was Yamamoto's chief of staff, architect of much of the plan, and a man with an enormous personal stake in proving the operation flawless. So when the dice predicted disaster, Ugaki simply changed the rules to guarantee success. Japan in May 1942 was intoxicated by victory. In only 6 months, the Imperial Navy had seized an empire stretching from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies, and the string of conquests seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor had been smashed on December 7. 10 hours later, the American Air Forces in the Philippines were wiped out on the ground. 2 days after that, British warships once considered untouchable, Prince of Wales and Repulse, were sunk by Japanese aircraft. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila collapsed on January 2nd. The unstoppable fortress of Singapore surrendered in February with 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March, delivering the oil fields Japan desperately needed, and Burma fell in May, isolating China and threatening India. Japan's 4 premier carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had struck across the Pacific without suffering a single loss. Their pilots flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, the finest carrier fighter in the world, capable of outturning, outclimbing, and outranging anything the Allies fielded. Everywhere the Japanese military went, victory followed. This bred a deadly arrogance that Japanese officers called shoribyo, victory disease, the assumption that more victories were inevitable simply because all victories before had been so easy. It infected every level of planning, including the war games aboard Yamato. The mess hall had been stripped of furniture and replaced with a 40-foot table covered in a grid map showing Midway, Hawaii, and the vast ocean between. Wooden blocks represented ships, colored pins marked formations and movements. Dice determined combat results, fuel consumption, aircraft losses, and the unpredictable chaos of war. Multiple umpires sat around the table, each responsible for managing part of the simulation. In theory, this was an honest test. In practice, it became a ceremony designed to validate a predetermined conclusion. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the Carrier Strike Force, led the Pearl Harbor attack. He was competent but deeply aware that Yamamoto's staff distrusted him and had criticized him for not launching a third strike at Pearl Harbor. Fearing further criticism, he offered no challenges to the plan. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commanding the invasion force, raised concerns, especially about the impossibility of supplying Midway, which lay far beyond Japan's logistical range, but he was ignored. The plan was already approved. On the first day of war gaming, Japanese forces advanced flawlessly. Umpires rolled dice that routinely favored Japan. When the dice suggested Japanese losses, Ugaki intervened, eliminating or reducing damage. The pivotal moment came on day 2. In the scenario, Nagumo's carriers were attacking Midway while their aircraft were airborne. A junior officer playing the American side made a bold move. He launched land-based bombers from Midway against the Japanese carriers at precisely the moment they were most vulnerable. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, responsible for adjudicating the strike, rolled the dice. A 9. According to the damage tables, that meant 2 carriers, Akagi and Kaga, were sunk. Ugaki immediately overruled the result. He reduced 9 hits to 3. Kaga remained sunk, but Akagi was downgraded to damaged and still operational. Okumiya, junior in rank, stayed silent. Everyone in the room understood what Ugaki's interference meant. The purpose of the games was not to test reality, but to confirm what High Command wanted to be true. Even this was too realistic for Ugaki. Later during the games, when the timeline had moved on from Midway to hypothetical later operations, Kaga, which had been sunk earlier, magically reappeared on the map without explanation. Other manipulations followed. American reconnaissance was ruled ineffective. American aircraft behaved in ways convenient to the Japanese plan. When the American player tried positioning his carriers early, exactly what the United States would do in reality, Ugaki declared the move impossible and forced the carriers to stay at Pearl Harbor until after Midway was attacked. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's brightest carrier tacticians and architect of Pearl Harbor, warned that the Americans were capable of surprising Japan and might already be near Midway. His warnings were politely dismissed. The game was forced to follow the script. At the end of 4 days, the war games concluded successfully. The plan was flawless. Japan would win a decisive victory. The Americans would be crushed. Reality, however, was preparing a very different outcome. The first lie underlying the plan was that Japanese communications were secure. In truth, American cryptanalysts had cracked the JN-25 naval code. Commander Joseph Rockefort and his team at Station HYPO in Hawaii had been reading Japanese communications for months. By April, they strongly suspected the target, called AF, was Midway. Washington doubted it, so Rockefort orchestrated a trick. He had Midway send an unencrypted message claiming their water distillation plant had failed. When Japanese intelligence soon reported that AF was short on water, HYPO had its proof. Japan believed it held strategic surprise. In fact, it had none. The second lie was that the United States had only 2 operational carriers. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese pilots believed they had sunk Yorktown. In reality, though heavily damaged, Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, knowing the attack on Midway was imminent, ordered emergency repairs. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock under blackout conditions. Repairs that should have taken 3 months were completed in 72 hours. Yorktown sailed with repair crews still aboard. Japan expected 2 American carriers. In reality, 3 would be waiting. The third lie was the assumption about timing. Yamamoto believed American carriers would remain at Pearl Harbor until Midway was attacked. Instead, Nimitz sent Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to sea days in advance, positioning them northeast of Midway at Point Luck. They were already in perfect position before the battle began. The real battle unfolded 1 month after the war games. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway, 108 aircraft. He also launched 7 scout planes. One, from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult issues, a delay that would alter the course of history. The first strike damaged but did not neutralize Midway. A second strike was requested. Nagumo ordered aircraft on deck to be rearmed with land bombs. Then the late scout reported sighting American ships. Nagumo halted rearming. A follow-up message confirmed American carriers. He ordered torpedoes reloaded. The resulting chaos left his carriers cluttered with fueled and armed aircraft, the very vulnerability the war games had predicted but dismissed. At 9:30 a.m., American torpedo bombers attacked. They were slaughtered. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost all 15 aircraft. Only Ensign George Gay survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 12 of 13. Not a single torpedo hit. Their sacrifice, however, dragged Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, just as the American dive bombers arrived overhead. At 10:22, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Wade McCluskey, and 17 from Yorktown, led by Max Leslie, found the Japanese carriers. With fighters down low and decks cluttered with bombs and fuel, the carriers were defenseless. In 5 minutes, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were mortally hit. Fires detonated stored ordnance, turning the carriers into infernos. By nightfall, all 3 were gone. Hiryu alone survived and struck back, hitting and eventually crippling Yorktown. But American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and put 4 bombs into her. She sank the next morning. 4 Japanese carriers, lost exactly as the dice had predicted. Japan tried to hide the disaster. Radio Tokyo claimed victory. The public never learned the truth until after the war. Even within the military, only top officers knew the scale of the defeat. Replacement pilots were told their predecessors had been reassigned, not killed. Strategic planning continued under the delusion that Japan still had a functioning carrier fleet. In reality, Midway shattered Japan's offensive capability. The United States seized the initiative with the Guadalcanal landings in August 1942. Without experienced pilots, Japan's carriers became empty hulls. Meanwhile, American production exploded. New Essex-class carriers arrived monthly. Escort carriers were built by the dozens. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in the tens of thousands. Japan could never catch up. Ugaki survived Midway, though whispers about his role in the war games circulated quietly. He served until 1945, struggling internally with growing awareness that the war was lost but never fully acknowledging his responsibility. After Japan surrendered, he led an unauthorized kamikaze mission and died, one of the last casualties of a war prolonged by arrogance. The truth about the rigged war games surfaced publicly in 1955 when Mitsuo Fukuda and Masatake Okumiya published their account. They revealed how Ugaki had overridden the dice and forced outcomes to match assumptions. Their revelations shocked historians. Modern military institutions now treat the Midway war games as a warning, a study in confirmation bias, organizational blindness, and the fatal danger of believing comforting illusions over uncomfortable truth. The dice had predicted disaster. Ugaki refused to believe them. Reality did not care. In 5 minutes on June 4th, 4 carriers were destroyed, 3,000 men were killed, and Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific died, all because a war game meant to reveal flaws was instead manipulated to hide them.